Hello, everyone. Video sorted here. Hi, thank you for joining us this evening. You're watching a live stream from the Chicago Composers Orchestra. My name is Randall West. I'm CCO's artistic director. We're so excited to share music with you virtually now, even though we can't do that in person. I also want to say that as an arts organization, many of you know we postponed our program last week. I want to say that as an arts organization, we stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with our Black musicians and friends and community. We conceived of this project originally as a way to bring people together during this pandemic, and I think current events make that no less important and make this kind of programming essential. So again, thank you for joining with us. The musicians you're hearing tonight are Lauren Hayes on harp, Alexandria Hill on violin, Colin Marsek on trombone, Bryce O'Tierney on violin, and Greg Strauss on trumpet. And I'm going to share a gallery view with everyone, so everyone can wave. Hello. Wave, everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Okay. 1 second here. All the musicians and composers are on the chat tonight, and we'll have a Q&A and discussion later in the program, so please stick around for that. You can use the YouTube chat feature throughout the program. As questions come up, someone will be monitoring that and saving those questions for the end for the musicians. The Chicago Composers Orchestra is a contemporary music orchestra based in Chicago. Our mission is to present orchestral music by living composers, to extend the orchestral tradition, to make it open, vibrant, and diverse, and to speak to our lives today. What you just saw and heard was a graphic score by Chicago composer Kyung-Mi Choi called Impact 2. And more about what you're seeing. This was a graphic score, and what that means is when you think of traditional music notation, you think of sounds or symbols being used to convey specific pitches for musicians, specific pitches and rhythms. You might see something that looks like this. Give me a second here. So you'll see something that looks kind of like this. Do you like my music note face? Where the green blob represents the length of duration to play. Maybe the height, like this, would indicate the pitch, and so on. But what if a composer wants to communicate something that maybe this symbol doesn't exactly specify? Or what if a composer wants to leave musical interpretation up more to a musician as opposed to specifying everything exactly? So while traditional music notation might look more like that, starting in the 20th century and continuing through today, composers began to invent their own symbols, graphics as a way to communicate either different kinds of options for music making, or as a way to invite composers or invite musicians to improvise or to share their own, create their own musical interpretations. So, for example, we might have a. Give me 1 second here. Share an example. We might have a score that doesn't have a music note head, but looks a little more like that. So now I'm a snake, and if someone is asked to read what a score, to read this and make sense of it musically, well, that's up for interpretation. And I have to apologize to Kyung-Mi Choi, whose video score I ripped off of to make this silly graphic. So Kyungmi, hope you don't mind. But I wanted to introduce that concept to everyone who's listening because I think it's a really fun concept, and that's the idea that we're sharing with you tonight. We conceived of this project with the help of a composer named Danny Clay. Danny Clay is a composer based in San Francisco who works heavily with participatory projects, projects that involve music making by ensembles and communities as ways to bring people together. And Danny actually created one of these graphic scores, which we'll be sharing with you in a couple of weeks on June 29th, so he'll be on that call. I also want to share with you I'm going to switch back to my more normal video here. Give me 1 second here, so you don't have to deal with me as a snake. Okay. There we go. I want to share with you a short blurb written by one of our board members who interviewed Danny, the creator of the project, and who interviewed the musicians about what we're doing. He described graphic notation as a conviction that music making is there inside us, waiting for something to kindle it, to call it forth. The music that eventually comes forth may not be all the hand that the composer thought she dealt. The result is a musical creation that none of the players fully envisioned at the start. So this is in our Half Notes blog, and I'm going to share with you that on YouTube here. So if you want to check out our blog post about graphic scores, I just posted a link in YouTube right now. Okay. So what we've done is we've collected these graphic scores from several composers and animators, which we'll be showing with you over the next few weeks. And we're going to share with you our interpretations and then ultimately invite anyone who's interested to create their own interpretations along with us. So what I'm going to play for you now is another graphic score by Kyungmi Choi. And first I'm going to play the score without any sound. And for those of you listening and watching, I want you to think about what a musical interpretation of what you're seeing might be. Maybe the colors mean something to you. Maybe the way the objects move up and down might be interpreted differently. So just watch that and think about it as you're watching it, and then there'll be a short pause, and then then you'll hear the CCO's interpretation of that same score. So that was a graphic score by Kyungmi Choi. Uh, and Kyungmi is here with us. And Kyungmi, I want to ask you your inspiration behind the piece and how you created it. Actually, I believe maybe Kyungmi dropped off. I'm just looking at the Zoom chat and I don't see her at the moment. So, well, if anyone has a question for Kyungmi, we can return to that in the Q&A later, and I apologize about that. I am going to share with you another graphic score. This is a score that I created. It's called Wandering Burst, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to play the score silently, and then think about it as you're watching it, and then you'll hear musicians from the CCO interpret that score. So that was a short score that I created. I'm going to share one more for you that I created as well. And again, the same idea. First, I'm going to share the score silently, think about it, and then you'll hear our interpretation of it. So that was a score that I created called Notations, and I believe we have Kyungmi Choi on right now. So I thought we'd take a moment, and Kyungmi, I'm interested to hear quickly about how you created your piece, and I can share how I created mine, and then after sharing that, we're going to move on to a live interpretation from a CCO musician.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yes. Oh, thank you so much. It was very great to have this opportunity. And the idea behind of my score was to show that everything is somehow connected and everything is affecting others. And I just wanted to create somewhat more gestures and the motions so that it could be interpreted more rhythmically, and also the not necessarily pitch material in particular, but I wanted to have some kind of the height that might be interpreted into frequency range for a performer. So anything that we think, in a philosophical level, that we think it's not really related, is actually deep down, it was all interconnected. So that's why I wanted to name Impact.
Cool. Um, Kyungmi, clearly you're using some kind of computer software to generate the score, and I did the same with mine actually, and that
Mm,
was part of that was part of my reason behind grouping you and me on the same program.
mm.
I'm curious, how did that work for you? What did you use?
Okay. Yes, I use the Blender
Oh, cool.
software. Yes, and then it is the 3D animation software that I'm really fascinated by, and then I started learning, and I'm enjoying it very much.
Cool.
Yes.
I like to geek out over those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I'm using a program called OpenRender, which is code based,
Oh,
and
okay.
for many of you on the line, if are familiar with my music, I like to involve a lot of things that aren't entirely set in stone, where things are a little bit random and there's lots of things happening at once. So I was
Mm,
able to program in some random motion in that score.
very cool. Very cool.
So, well, so what you've heard so far has been pre-recorded. So musicians from the CCO have watched these scores and then recorded their interpretations, and then we mixed them together. But we do have one of our CC musicians who's going to share a live interpretation with us right now. Her name is Lauren Hayes on harp. And Lauren, I'll kick it over to you. And Lauren's going to share an interpretation of the same four scores that we just saw and heard. So you'll see the same four scores by Kyungmi Choi and by myself, performed by Lauren Hayes. Thank you, Lauren. I have one quick question for you for the benefit of everyone listening in. In the first piece, you played an interesting technique that had like a buzzing sound. Can you describe what you were doing there?
So I was doing two things with the harp. The first one, I had paper strung through the strings, near the bottom of the strings, near the soundboard. So it creates a kind of pizzicato, but also a buzzy sound. And then I also had a tuning key, what we use to tune the harp, stuck in the pedals. So it was actually in between two pedal rods. So on the harp, we get buzzy sounds if you hear the pedal moving. So I was basically keeping the pedal stuck at the buzzy sound to make sure when I played the note that the pedal was stuck in, that it created that grinding sound.
Cool. That's really cool. Well, if anyone has more questions for Lauren, put that in the chat, and in just a moment we will start the Q&A. So what you've heard so far have been individual interpretations of each scores, meaning that, well, in Lauren's case, she's playing solo, but in the earlier versions that we shared with you, everyone who was performing decided on their own the way they wanted to interpret it. But we're an orchestra, right? So that means we're performing together. So what we also did is we met ahead of time as a group, and everyone discussed for each of these scores what might be a meaningful interpretation. And that varied from very simple things like we're going to play just these pitches, or we're going to think of something that sounds kind of grainy, or different ideas like that. But then everyone created an interpretation that was based off of that group interpretation. So I'm going to share with you that. I'm going to play back the same 4 scores again, but this time we're going to hear performances that are totally different, and that are these group interpretations from everyone. We had the all done message as a note to the performers when they were recording that that the video was done, and someone, I think Colin, it was you, said all done at the end, so we felt like we had to leave that in the final version. I like that. Well, I'm going to start Q&A in just a moment. Before starting that, I want to mention a couple of ways that everyone listening in can be involved. First of all, as I mentioned early on, Danny Claves, the composer who conceived of this project with us, really works in participatory kinds of projects. And when we conceived of this project, we really wanted to be a way for our community to participate. So what that means is that we're sending out an open invitation for anyone to create your own interpretation of one of these graphic scores, and we'll be posting them on social media, so look on our social media to see those. You don't have to be a professional musician. You don't have to read music. If you do, that's great. But if you care about sharing sound with us way, we would love to hear that. So we'll be showing those instructions. Please look for that. And we'll be combining all of these recordings and videos into a final collage across the 4 weeks. Secondly, we'll do the same streaming program again next week. So check back on Monday, June 15th at the same time, 7:30. And then finally, this is a program tonight. If you did enjoy what you've heard and what you've seen, please consider making a donation to support our musicians and our future programming. And if you give $25 or more, you will receive a complimentary thank you graphic score that's been customized with your name on it. So if you're so inclined, I would invite everyone to support us that way. And I'm going to put a link for donations in our YouTube chat. So our music director, Alan Tinkham, is on the line as all the musicians and composers who you heard tonight. And Alan, I'm going to kick it over to the Q&A for the next 20 minutes or so, and it looks like we have a couple of questions already in the chat.
Randall, thank you very much. Just to begin, I want to say thank you so much to everyone who is watching right now. Randall, thank you, and Kyung-mi for your scores, to all the musicians tonight for your participation, to Lauren especially for her live interpretation of these 4 scores. I cannot tell you how much I miss the orchestra and all of these wonderful people, and I'm thrilled to be here, at least virtually together. And one of the things I thought was most fascinating about this project is the number of different levels of inquiry. First, there's the idea of a graphic score. What does that mean? The idea of a piece of animation that a musician then observes and tries to interpret in some musical way. Now, this isn't really the craziest thing, because all of musical notation is approximate. And even though this musical language we think of as Western musical notation has had over 3,000 years to develop and to evolve, there are still lots of questions. Whenever musicians open a piece of music, we see information that is never complete. The score will tell you what pitches to play. It'll tell you approximately when to play them. It'll tell you approximately how to play them, but it's all pretty approximate. And of course, this is the primary creativity of us recreative musicians, those who don't compose but play other people's music. Another important aspect of this, I thought, is the way the individual interpretations of the musicians then become a communal interpretation of the pieces, even though, and just to make sure everyone understands this, the pieces that you just heard with everyone playing together were recorded individually by all these musicians at home without any idea of what the other musicians were going to do, except for a small few variables that we decided upon in our discussions. So there is a lot going on here, and I think a nice place to begin would be to talk with, let's talk with Lauren about your interpretation of these 4 scores. Tell us a little bit about what you did.
So I spent some time when I first got these and just kind of absorbed them. Took a look at what I felt, what I heard, if you will. So I was influenced a lot by the colors and the movements. But for each one, I kind of had a different theme. So for the first one I played, Kyung-mi Choi's one that we had said looked a little bit like a snake, I thought about, it reminded us of Gears, and I think we had all thought of that a little bit as it was. And so that initially got me to the buzzing sounds on the harp and using some extended techniques of using the paper to get some non-traditional sounds. For the second one of Kyung-mi's,
Lauren, I'm sorry, before you go on, I just wanted to get in a little bit deeper to the idea you just expressed about Kyungmi's first piece, reminding us of gears. Tell me why that is. What made you feel that? I mean, of course, we talked about it all in our rehearsal, but how do we get from this picture to, this picture of what very obviously is not actual gears to the feeling of gears or machinery or.
So looking at each of these videos, I think there were so many different parts to observe. And several of this one, we saw the pieces kind of moving in and out of what we kind of described as the sand. But it wasn't always a smooth motion. It was jagging and pushing and pulling, I would say. And so that kind of just felt like a gear moving backwards and forwards quite frequently. But also how all the parts move together, which is another part of gears, how they all intertwine. So they're all simultaneously moving in and out of each other.
That's great, Laura. Now I'm sorry I interrupted you as you were going on to Kyungmi's second piece. Tell us about what you did there.
So the second one, I believe what she called Impact, reminded me a lot of ping pong balls. And just because of the monochromatic color, gave me a sense of calm for that one. So I used a lot of glissandos and a more of a major feel for this one. And also gave me the idea for using a lot of harmonics. It gives a light, bouncy, airy sound. We discussed a little bit of the balls bouncing in and out like ping pong. Someone had even said, I think, field goals, something like that, because you had parts moving in and out of each other. So it was a little bit more fluid than some of the other ones.
That's great, Lauren. Maybe tell us just a bit about your interpretation of Randall's scores as well. And those were called Wandering Burst and Notations.
So the Wandering Burst ones was the one with the black, the two black lines that were protruding out at the beginning. And I thought of, because it started very stark, monochromatic, and then developed into so many colors and almost blossomed. So I kind of was thinking of a whole tone scale, and that was what I initially used for my interpretation. So on the harp, we're very fortunate that we can just set our pedals. So a whole tone scale is a mode or so that we can set on the harp. So I started with that, and then the blossoming of the colors reminded me of a fugue setting. So I tried each interpretation to think about how I could develop from a simple to a more complex, similarly to what in Western classical music we would consider a fugue. And then, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Lauren, please.
And then in the second score by Randall, so I really thought about the contrary motion of the figures coming in and from all sides. So on the harp, we have lots of dimensions. So I used glissandos initially to show the vertical dimension, and then I used scraping on the strings up and down to show the horizontal dimensions, to try and get all four of those moving in and out. And then I looked at the harmonic series, because that's what the developing of the lines, and it seemed like it would be a very tonal. The colors were all nice together. The lines were smooth, nothing jagged, and then they always faded out. But there was a great point where all the colors were really intense. So I tried to show that in each one as well.
Lauren, I loved your metaphor there for with the harmonic series, the idea that in the same way, one pitch, one tone can contain many other tones or pitches within it, as the frequencies and harmonic relation provide. In the same way, colors can all contain other colors, and I just thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about that. How about, there's an interesting question here in the chat for Kyungmi and Randall, asking if you learned anything new about your scores from the musicians' wonderful interpretations. What can you tell us about that?
I will share, if you guys can hear me. Can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
I found it's fascinating to hear so many different versions and different kind of nuance. And you know, when we use a regular notation, then approximate anticipation, it's relatively close range. But this case was absolutely very different, and timbre was different, the dynamic was different, and interaction was different. So I think it just opens up the possibilities of how much of different kind of sonority can come out. Itself was just a lot of wonderful way of understanding my own score. So it was a very good experience.
Randall, I see you talking, but I don't hear you for some reason. Don't hear it. Uh-oh. Well, while we're getting that fixed, Kyung-mi, I had one thing you said in your introduction of your pieces, which was about the, I believe it was number one, impact number one, the idea that the rising and falling elements in the score were in your mind suggesting pitches, and I bring that out because I think that in our various interpretations there were a lot of other ideas going on there that were in some ways more abstract. You know. Gathering ideas about texture from the score, gathering ideas about tone color from the score, instead of just pitches, which honestly would have been the most obvious thing. And yet somehow, you know, as we look into these scores and we wonder what is it we should get from these, it's amazing the variety of ideas that come about. Can you tell us a little bit about apart from the idea of pitch in your score, what other elements you might have been going for?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. The pitch is just something that I use as an example, but you know, as we know, there are so many different parameters in our music making. So if somebody decide to interpret those motion as a dynamic motion, or some people try to interpret as a color that goes very soft to very dark, or bright to dark, or you know, it depends on what focus individual performer wants to give. That I think has a lot of opening there too. But I guess somehow we are so used to this kind of high and low and comes close to and go away. It's sort of a way we think about musical contour. And I think different musicians will use differently, or they can use simultaneously 2 or 3 parameters at the same time. So high pitch goes to higher dynamic, or even tense, you know, or dense texture. So I think it opens up so many options, but at the same time, I think experienced musicians will use their instinct or their own musical interpretation to create a more cohesive result out of this unceasing openness. if I answer your question.
Kyung-mi, thank you for that. And it's interesting you mention experienced musicians, because that is so much of, you know, obviously we all in the interpretation of such scores bring everything we are as musicians to this very fine point of the interpretation of this very short, very abstract score. There was an interesting question in the chat. I'd like to open up to the musicians here, the performers. Would you guess someone without music training would necessarily interpret the scores differently? And so I guess what we're asking is, how do you feel your training in any way affects positively or even negatively your ability to interpret such abstract scores? Why don't we start with, let's see, Colin, you're in the top left of my screen. If would you mind jumping in there? Tell us a little bit about that. Do you feel like your training held you back at all here?
So when we were doing our meeting in regards to our group interpretation, I feel like there was a good touching stone, like our collective musical training, because we were talking about tone, color, and like different articulations we could use, but also just like different like harmonic devices we could use that we could all agree upon. So like for example, the one of Randall's pieces, we decided to do two different Lydian modes, and sort of like having an understanding of the Lydian mode and like how that creates a specific feeling. We could all agree upon like we're looking for this feeling, and this is a good way to express it. But also on the other hand, like not worrying about all that stuff, you know, you could almost be more free. So I think it's a balancing act of you know, trying to inform things and agree upon things, but also just like being free to improvise.
Colin, I love that answer because it is such a combination for all of us. You know, we have our training, which gives us a language with which we can discuss to some extent what we're doing. But at the same time, you have to be ready to let all of that go in the interest of interpreting this, you know, what can really only be loosely described as a musical score, at least in terms of how we generally think of musical scores. Any of the other performers here want to add anything to that?
I'll jump in. I think also the more exposure you've had to some contemporary music might influence how you approach these or how you would think about these for thinking about the different aspects. I've worked with video quite a lot in the past, but in a different way where sounds link up with specific movements. So that thought process was not entirely new to me, but for someone who might not have experienced that, they might have a completely different idea of what they see when they see the video or what their initial aspect. But to go off of what Colin said too, I think leaving self-criticism at the door when you go into the creative space is so important, but can definitely hinder if you start judging what's coming out or what you're creating.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lauren. How about Bryce, Greg, Alexandria? What do you guys think of this? Go ahead, jump in.
Sure, I'll chime in. I mean, I really had a lot of fun with this project. I've done a lot of recording in the past, but this was certainly unique. I was really surprised to hear the final product in a good way. Everyone sounds like they really put a lot of thought into this. I think the opportunities are endless, which is so cool. And I think even endless in the sense of how much experience you have with an instrument or with performing or with recording. I'll definitely agree with Colin and Lauren that analyzing your own interpretation can sometimes be hindering. And I guess you could make the argument that someone who has studied music or spent more time performing might be more prone to be a little analytical. But I think that's also a beautiful thing too. I think you grow as a musician from listening to your playing in a different way. You know, so I loved it. I think it would be a really cool, I think it's very awesome that you guys are asking the community to try to include their interpretations too. Yeah, hats off to the composers on this one.
Greg, that's fantastic. Thank you. How about Bryce? What would you say about this?
Sure. I found the process to be really different between my own interpretations and the group consensus. I think with my own interpretations, like others have been saying, like leaving the self-criticism at the door was necessary. I have done recording work in the past, and it felt similar to being in the studio and just sort of trusting my gut with a first take, what my sort of visceral response was to the movement. And I found myself thinking a lot about dance, like the experience of making music with these, you know, animations and motion just reminded me of what it would be like, you know, working with dancers. So that was sort of an interesting experience to have. But I did find it actually more difficult to go back after our group conversation and respond to these again because I had these parameters in mind. And so it took me a little bit longer to sort of decide what I was going to do. So that was just interesting to feel the difference between those two things.
Bryce, that is fantastic. Thank you. And I think that's a really interesting point you made there, sort of quickly early on, and that is noticing your own biases. And in this way, this is a metaphor for so many things. You know, we all have biases that we carry with us all the time, and you know, part of really being open to new ideas and new music especially is being aware of those biases and trying to sort of push back against them. Alexandria, what would you say?
I would agree in terms of self-criticism and traditional music. You know, we often say if you're recording something very traditional, concertos or excerpts or something, you know, we record it 10,000 times over looking for like the perfect take. But then that kind of all dissolves away with contemporary music, especially interpretive things like this project. I did one take for each clip, and I didn't even question, you know, I didn't like listen back to it and criticize what I was hearing because there is no standard that we hold ourselves to with projects like this, unlike, you know, music of the old days where there's 1,000 standards to follow. For this one, it's sort of like we're I guess moving forward without, what's the word? I guess without trapping ourselves in any standard.
That is such a great point, and it's a really easy thing to do. And this gets back a little bit to the topic we were discussing earlier, musical training, and how this affects the way we look at such scores. It is very hard to not be limited by what you think music should be. And that's part of what was so interesting about this project and improvisatory projects in general, especially with musicians who don't all that often improvise. I mean, it's one thing when you're talking about jazz musicians where, you know, their bread and butter is creating brand new pitches, brand new music from the very you know, most basic level all the time. But this is not something that we orchestral musicians do that often. We are trained to be correct in many ways, and we are trained to reject things that are not correct. Most importantly, you really feel that as a music student, you find yourself going to concerts and it's very quick to go to, oh, well, this was wrong and that was wrong. And what a project like this, I think, should really do is get us to let go of all of that and really be open to whatever happens. This is, and actually, Greg, you made the point a little bit earlier about hearing the piece combined for the first time, all the parts combined. And what were the surprises that we heard? Greg, why don't you go ahead since you...
I think the group consensus, obviously we were on the same page for that, but my surprise came with just, it seemed like a lot of us were on the same, we're thinking along the same lines for some of our own interpretation. I heard a lot of, and perhaps this maybe had to do with our conversation as a group, but I heard a lot of swells around the same time from different instruments, elements of when I think Randall's wandering verse comes to mind. When that color burst came out, it almost sounded very, very melodic and very tonal, whereas I heard a lot of tritones before and afterwards. And so that was really unique to me that, oh, wow, that was my idea. And I think even Lauren actually said that one clip reminded her of ping pong. And that's like the first thing I thought of was playing ping pong in outer space for, I think, the Impact 2 video. So it was just, it was cool to see that collaboration come together.
Greg, thank you so much for that. And while I personally could talk about this all night, I think it's about time for us to wrap. But I just wanted to say thank you once again to all of the musicians all the performers who collaborated on this project, to Randall and Kyung Mi for your fantastic and really thought-provoking scores, and to everyone watching for your attention and for your support. And if you feel like it, you can go ahead and make a little donation, because we would love to continue making musical products like this for you. And luckily, even though we have to cut the conversation here, there will be many chances to continue this discussion, because we're going to be doing this on Monday night next week, and the following week, and the week after that. The next 3 Monday nights, we're going to be doing some more of this. Same time. Randall, am I forgetting anything? Is there anything you'd like to add to close? All right. Well, thanks everyone so much. And to our composers, to our performers, to our audience, we appreciate you. And I personally am so thrilled to be doing this. I miss live music so much. And this is at this time when we can't do that, this is really a fantastic substitute. So thanks everyone very much. And we'll wrap it there. Take care, be well, and hopefully see you Monday night.
Thank you. Nice job, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.